O'Brien. I am Christopher Harrison. What we're going to do is introduce ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about what it is that we're going to talk about, and then get on into kind of what Xamarin is all about. So first up, my name, like I mentioned a second ago, is Christopher Harrison. I'm a senior content producer here at Microsoft Learning. I'm a longtime MCT, I'm a web guy, big OSS fan, and then outside of work, I'm a husband, I'm a marathoner, and I'm a father of one four-legged child. And Jerry?
Yeah, I love your prelude. We're going to talk about what we're going to talk about.
See?
I love that stuff.
Thank you.
So who am I? Yeah, so I'm Jerry O'Brien. I'm a senior content developer here at Microsoft Learning. Primary focus is on the developer audience. Again, a longtime MCT like Christopher. Formerly a consultant, book and course author, car enthusiast. You must have thrown that one in at the bottom. Right?
I did, but it's true, you are.
But it is true, yeah, because I'm constantly wheeling and dealing and changing cars and stuff. But what I tell people most importantly, though, is I'm a lifelong learner, so I love to learn. I'm continuously learning something, a new language or the new features of something, or moving on to where I can better myself. So I love helping people get to that point as well.
It's actually one of the best parts of this job.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway. So let's talk about what it is that we're going to talk about. You'll notice that I have an agenda here, not hidden. So this module is the basics of what is Xamarin. Talk about why you might want to choose Xamarin for your development. Module 2 will take a look at how to install Xamarin. There's a few little tips, tricks that you need to know when you get in to do that. Module 3 will do our Hello Xamarin. We'll take a look at a Xamarin project, how to get up and running there. Module 4, we'll take a look at how to do testing on an emulator. And then in 5, we'll take a look at how to do our debugging and see how you can do step through, even if you happen to be connected to a Mac, which is pretty slick. And then finally, last but not least, because emulators are exactly that, they're emulators, if you want to test it on an actual device, we're going to show you how to sideload your app into a device. Now, the first big question, though, that we want to ask is, what is Xamarin? Well, put simply, Xamarin is going to allow you to write your applications using Visual Studio and in .NET. Now, what you're going to have is you're going to have a shared library that, again, is written in .NET. Uses standard .NET libraries. This is where your business logic is going to go. This is where your data access code is going to go. And again, stop me if you've heard this before, it's using .NET. So all of those skills that you already have, you can now apply to writing mobile applications by using Xamarin. And then from there, what you're going to do is you're going to have different facades for the different platforms, which leads us perfectly into the next question of why use Xamarin? Well, because again, it's built on .NET, it's built on the skills that you already have, and this is most important, is it allows you to easily target multiple platforms. So you can target Windows Mobile, you can target iOS, and you can target Android, all from the same project. And sometimes you can even do so without having to create those facades and have that write once and have that work on every mobile platform. But if you are looking to get into device specific and work in the idioms on those general devices, it's much easier to do this here than it is to fire up Xcode, than it is to fire up all the other various tools and write for each one of those platforms. And so that really is what Xamarin is all about.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. So, like I said, very short little intro module. Really just wanted to talk about what Xamarin is. But of course, you probably actually want to see Xamarin. But to do that, we need to install that. And that's actually going to be in the next module. So we'll see you in the next module. Hey, welcome back to Xamarin for Absolute Beginners. Alongside Jerry O'Brien, I'm Christopher Harrison. In the last module, we took a look at the basics of Xamarin, kind of set the stage of why it is that you might want to use Xamarin. But obviously, again, if you're going to use Xamarin, you need to install it. And in order to install it, there's a few little prerequisites that you need to be familiar with. Now, of course, you could use Xamarin just to write, say, Windows mobile apps or just to write Android apps. But chances are, if you're going to do this, you want to target them all.
Yes.
So if you want to target all platforms, you are going to need two things. You can have Windows either running as parallels on a Mac or locally installed on, say, a little Surface Book or the like. And again, the big thing about that copy of Windows is it cannot be virtualized, not able to use a VM. The reason for that is you are going to want to use the emulators. The emulators do require virtualization. You can't virtualize inside a virtualized environment. I think I said that right?
Something like that.
Something like that?
Virtually.
Okay. Virtually.
Yes.
I virtually said that correct. So anyway, so you do need to have an actual real installed copy of Windows. You also will need Mac OS X. This is a requirement if you're going to be targeting iOS, so then that way it can compile properly and do everything that it needs to be done. But if you take a look at Jerry's setup over here, and he's got just a couple of devices going on over there. I love the fact that you've got the phones hung off of there. There we go.
I'll add the third phone.
There we go. Perfect. Yeah. So we've got the whole setup over here. But you'll notice that he's actually got his Mac sitting over to the side, and he's going to remote into that when he wants to start working with iOS. Mm-hmm. Again, you could do all your development on a Mac, but if you just feel more comfortable in Windows and want to do all your development on Windows and have a remote Mac, you can go that route. Now, in order to do the installation, you'll notice that this is available as an option through Visual Studio. Make sure that you put the little dot next to custom, which chances are you probably do anyway. And then you'll notice that you've got cross-platform mobile development. Put the little check right there next to C#/.NET Xamarin. And then from there, you do the installation. And it looks, well, a little bit like what, Jerry?
Well, if we switch over to my PC, we'll start taking a look at where we go for installing on the PC side. Obviously, as Christopher talked about, we're going to need Visual Studio because we are developing in .NET after all. Mm-hmm. And what better tool to use than the free Visual Studio 2015 Community Edition. Mm-hmm. So it's a full-featured IDE, and if you're not familiar with it, let's say you're an Android developer or you're an iOS developer coming to Xamarin and you're kind of new to the PC or the Visual Studio platform. If you go to visualstudio.com, then you can download Visual Studio Community 2015. Now this is a web installer, so that means that when you click on this button, it will bring up the web installer, downloads your short little .exe. You click on the run button, and it will go through the process of starting the install. And eventually, you end up with this little screen where you get to choose the options. And as Christopher mentioned, if you want to do the Xamarin development, you need to select at a minimum the cross-platform mobile development option. And you'll notice that underneath of it, it says C#/net or .NET, and it has Xamarin in parentheses. The reason it's grayed out, and I have this wonderful little blue icon, is because I didn't want you to sit through the install routine, so I already have it installed on my computer.
But that's what the screen looks like.
That's what the screen looks like. The other reason I wanted to show you this screen was in the event that you already have Visual Studio 2015 Community Edition installed, but you didn't put the cross-platform tools, you can simply go into the control panel and you can say, I want to change Visual Studio install, and you can basically come up to this screen and select that option. The other thing I wanted to point out as well, that we don't always deal with when you're installing your tools, but for the Android development, Visual Studio also has an emulator for Android, and I love to choose that. Of course, I'm the kind of person that I select all anyway because I like everything. As Christopher mentioned, the gadgets that I have here, I need it all, right? So I install everything.
More toys.
The Android development tools and the Android NDK that we actually install on Visual Studio gives us a built-in Visual Studio emulator, which is similar to the Windows 8.1 phone emulator. And it's got a lot of really neat, cool features and tools for you to work with. So we would have Visual Studio installed on our computer. Once it's done, you're almost ready to go, but we need to complete one more installation routine. So let's step over to the Mac, and I'll show you where you need to go on the Mac to be able to complete your installation routine. So on the Mac, where I'm at currently is what we call the Xamarin homepage. And in order for you to do development for the iOS portion, so if you want to actually develop for the iOS application side of it, including all of your mobile platforms, you're going to need to have the Xamarin platform installed on the Mac. And how you do that is select the products drop-down and choose the Xamarin platform. Now, what this does is, you notice it says you can create native iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows apps in C#. One of the things that we need to be aware of is when we download this tool, it will install something called Xamarin Studio. You can basically scroll through and see all the specific information that you have available down here, but you will actually get a Xamarin Studio product that gets installed on your Mac. Now, with the Xamarin Studio, when you create a new solution, this is a very important differentiator to understand. We cannot create Windows apps on Xamarin Studio on the Mac.
Okay, that's important.
That's important. We can only create iOS and Android apps in Xamarin Studio on the Mac.
Okay.
And I keep saying on the Mac because we can install Xamarin Studio on the PC.
Right, so and do everything there.
And do everything there, right? But because the Mac doesn't really support that Windows virtualization, etc., it's just iOS and Android on the Mac machine.
Okay.
Okay. Now, once we install Xamarin Studio on the Mac, we also get something called the Xamarin Mac Agent. And if you haven't updated recently, the Xamarin Mac Agent is what used to be known as the Xamarin Build Host. So we had something called the Xamarin Build Host that ran on the Mac. That's the component that is required to link your PC to your Mac for building the iOS-based applications. And the reason that you need that, this is an Apple licensing requirement. Apple only licenses the emulator and the build engine to run on an Intel-based Mac. So that's why you'll need to have the Xamarin Studio with the Mac Agent installed on the Mac, and your PC and your Mac able to connect to each other over the network.
Okay.
And as Christopher mentioned, you can certainly install Parallels for desktop on the Mac. And as you can see on my Mac, my start screen is annoying me. There we go. If we have Windows 10 up and running, Windows Parallels, we can start up Visual Studio 2015. I have it installed under Windows 10. And once again, it's one machine.
Right.
So I have the Mac Agent, and I have Windows and Visual Studio running, and we're ready to go.
So just to differentiate here, just to say it one more time, so if I do it in Visual Studio on Parallels on a Mac, I can now target all three of those platforms.
All three platforms.
But the Xamarin Studio on a Mac, I'm only able to just do the two.
Correct. iOS and Android.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And it's important, too, because the Parallels desktop app on the Mac is not technically the virtualization that you were talking about earlier. So we can run the Windows Phone emulators under Windows 10, under Parallels on the Mac.
Okay. So that's not virtualized.
Correct.
That's not virtualized.
Yeah.
Now the installation on a Mac, I'm gonna assume is pretty straightforward, just like installing any other piece of software.
Absolutely.
Nothing really fancy.
Nothing you have to worry about. Wizard-driven, step through, answer the questions, you're off and running.
Okay, and that will give us that Mac Agent. That will give us the Xamarin Studio. So now we've got Visual Studio set up on your Windows box. We've got the Mac Agent on Mac OS X.
Yes.
It seems like the next thing then to do is to well, create a project.
Yes.
We'll do that in the next module. Hey, welcome back. That's Jerry O'Brien. I'm Christopher Harrison. We've talked a bit about what Xamarin is all about, took a look at how to do the installation, but chances are if you're a developer, what you really want to see is some code, which we're going to get to right after a couple of real quick slides. So let's talk about how to get started with that first Xamarin project, or Hello Xamarin, if you will. Now, again, the great advantage to doing Xamarin is that you get to use the tools and the skills that you already are familiar with, that you already have, to create projects that can target all of those various devices. And so creating that Xamarin project is just like creating any other Visual Studio project. It's just simply now going to be Xamarin. Now, when you go in and set this up, you have really two ways that you can create your project. One way is to have that shared library that we talked about previously, and then all of the facades for those 3 different device types, or you can use Xamarin Forms. Now, what's amazing about Xamarin Forms is that you can create one project and write that one project in .NET and target all 3 of those platforms, again, with that one project. And in fact, that is what Jerry is going to show us how to do.
Absolutely.
Cool.
And I'm not going to type any code.
I like that.
Yeah. We're just going to do a bunch of point and clicks and show how things work.
I love it.
We'll demonstrate the code. We'll talk a little bit about it.
Of course.
Yeah, but nobody wants to see me typing code. I have fat fingers, and
we'd be here for a little while.
We'd be here for a little while.
All right.
So let's take a look at the PC. What we're going to do here is we're going to focus on creating a Xamarin Forms application, and we're going to create a new project. Now, what I'm demonstrating here is running Visual Studio on a PC, and the reason I'm demonstrating it this way is because the first time you fire this up and you start creating a new project on the PC, there's going to be some Xamarin login requirements, and there's going to be some connectivity requirements for you to connect to the Mac. So again, assuming that your environment may be that you're programming on a PC and you have perhaps a Mac server, a Mac Mini sitting in the office somewhere that a bunch of folks are accessing, this is kind of the environment type that you'll be looking at working through. So again, we're not assuming that I'm on the MacBook Pro here with everything integrated into the one machine. So again, as Christopher mentioned, hey, everything's familiar. We've got Visual Studio up and running. We click on the new project link over here on our start bar. And under the Visual C# template tree, we find cross-platform. So this is what we're going to focus on. But before we get into creating that project, I just want you to understand that there are other application types that you can create here. And one of them is iPhone as an example. And these ones here are going to be iPhone specific, right? So you're not targeting anything else but the iPhone platform or the iPad platform or the Android platform, okay? So these are just examples of the different types of apps that you can create in Visual Studio for that specific platform. But as we talked about, we want to focus on that cross-platform. Let's get the biggest bang for our buck. Let's create one project, write in C# code, and have it deployed across all of our platforms. So we'll choose the blank app Xamarin Forms Portable Class Library. So it's a multi-project template, as we see over here, allows you to build apps using Xamarin Forms. And that's key, because Xamarin Forms is what gives us that cross-platform UI functionality as well, okay? So we're going to create our new application. And what did you call it, Christopher? You didn't call it Welcome Xamarin. You called it Hello Xamarin.
Hello Xamarin.
So we'll call it Hello Xamarin.
That's a better name than App 2.
Yes. And as you can see by how long it took me to type the title, you don't want me typing code. So again, your standard Visual Studio options here, you can create a directory for the solution. We can add it to source control. We're not going to deal with that today. We just want to give you an idea of how we create a Xamarin Forms application. Now, as Visual Studio goes through the process of creating it, you'll see it's creating a project, and it's going to create a bunch of projects underneath the solution. So like most Visual Studio projects that we create, we have one solution, and then that solution will contain some different projects. We will have the shared code, which will sit in that portable class library, and then we will have separate projects for each of the platforms that we're going to target. So now that Visual Studio has created the project for us, a couple of things happen here. And this is one of the first steps that you're going to see is the Xamarin Mac agent instructions. So because Visual Studio recognizes this is a Xamarin project, it knows it needs to connect to that Xamarin Mac agent, and it's telling you that the first thing that you need to do is ensure that remote logon or remote login is enabled on your Mac. So let's look at the Mac for just 1 second, because if you're a Visual Studio developer or PC developer and you're not familiar with the Mac computer,
somebody like myself,
somebody like yourself, we have to go into the Mac. So let's look at the system preferences on the Mac here on the left-hand side. So on the Mac platform, we are in System Preferences under Sharing. We have to ensure that we have Remote Login enabled. Now, your administrators may deal with ensuring that certain users are allowed to access it. We're not going to go into Mac permissions here, but if you're the administrator on your Mac machine, simply enabling Remote Login is what you want to do. While you're in here, it's also a potentially good idea to pop into your network settings just in case you don't know what your IP address is, and you'll need to get it up here because that's what we're going to use to actually connect to the Xamarin Mac agent running on the Mac. So let's pop back over to the PC. And we have our remote login screen. Once you've seen this the first time, you can simply say, yeah, I got it. Don't show me again. Click OK. If you step through the steps, it'll tell you exactly how to do it as well if you're not familiar with it. So we're all done. And now the first thing it says, there's no remotely accessible Macs detected on your network. So we need to add a Mac. And here's where, guess what? That IP address is very important. So let's go ahead and add that IP address that we had for our Mac that is running right next to my PC. Let's click on Add. It'll do a retrieving of an SSH fingerprint, and this is where it's important for you, again, to know which user accounts are configured, and we will go through the process of logging in to the Mac. The retrieving SSH fingerprint for the first time sometimes takes a little bit of time for it to pop up. The other important thing to note as well is that if you have the Mac agent running on a machine, depending on the licensing that you have enabled, you may or may not be able to have more than one computer connected to that Mac agent at one time. All right, so we've successfully logged in to our Xamarin Mac agent, which is currently running on my little MacBook Pro over here on the left-hand side. And we can see in the Xamarin Mac agent dialog that we are indeed connected, and our little chain link icon here shows us that we are connected and ready to go.
Oh, I get it. That's clever. It's a chain link, so you're linked.
We're linked. We're linked.
Clever.
I didn't come up with it, so I'm not taking credit for it. All right, so the first time you create your Xamarin Forms application, you're going to get a Getting Started window that pops up. I almost call this a button, and it's kind of big for a button. And you can go ahead and have a look at this. It talks about next steps, some great resources to download, talking about pre-built templates, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go ahead and take a look at that, but we're going to close it down for right now, and we're going to focus specifically on dealing with what we now have for a solution with the projects within Visual Studio. So the first project in our solution is called Hello Xamarin, and it's got portable in parentheses. So this is our portable class library project. We have an Android project with appropriate properties, references, assets, resources, etc. We have a Hello Xamarin.iOS project. We have a Hello Xamarin Windows Phone project. And one that it didn't create for us was a Hello Windows project. But again, we're going to focus primarily on the 3 mobile platforms. So that's why we have these 3 projects available. Now, what's important for us to understand is how this project is going to be generated by using Xamarin Forms. If you're familiar with iOS and you're used to dealing with the interface builder, the UI builder, or you're used to dealing with the main activity and the XML file for Android applications to create that user interface, Xamarin Forms kind of changes that up a little bit. And what we're going to focus on here in this particular project template that was created is the use of the app class and the configuration or the way that it's actually writing the information out to the screen. So this is a really simple application. There's not a ton of different code or anything here, but it's just, again, we're trying to give you an idea of what the project structure looks like. Within our constructor for the app class, we have the root page of our application. So the main page is going to use a content page. We set up a stack layout. We set up center for the vertical options of this. And within the children, or sorry, a child of that page, we're going to create a new label, set the text alignment to center. And as I said, I'm not writing any code because what we're going to do is we're simply going to allow Visual Studio or the Xamarin Forms to display Welcome to Xamarin Forms on the screen. Within our app.cs class, we also have our onStart, onSleep, and onResume events that are available for us. Now, let's take a quick look at some of the project-specific attributes. Again, if you're a Xamarin developer, if we double-click on Properties, you'll see some of the configuration options in here that you should be familiar with as a Xamarin developer. We can compile using a specific Android version, and in this case, we're using the latest one. So unless you have a specific need to target other platforms, you're probably going to be on your latest one. Again, you can change your minimum Android target API level here and a targeted API. Excuse me. In this case, we're using use compile using the SDK version. You also have your Android manifest tab, in which case you would set your application name and your package name, versioning information, and of course all of your permissions that you might want that application to have. We can also take a look at the Xamarin.iOS properties. And we can see in here that there are a lot of familiar options for iOS developers. We have our SDK versions that we can work with. If we look at the iOS application tab, this is where we give it the name. This is where we would set our identifier, version information, devices, whether we're targeting universal, iPad, iPhone, etc. Supported device orientations, again for iPhone and iPad. And then, of course, a very important bundle signing option. And we'll talk about this in one of the later modules as we talk about deploying to an actual device itself. And iOS is one of the more complex ones that we will deal with. So this just gives you an idea of some of the properties for those different types of projects. And of course, with the Windows Phone one, if we look at the properties here, again, if you're used to developing for Windows Forms, we have our favorite startup object, and we have application-specific settings, supported cultures. You can set specific build or options, etc., from each one of these projects. So these are platform-specific configurations. Now, how does this application actually display the content on our screen? Well, let's go back real quick. Take a look at our app.cs. And again, notice what I said here was we have one label that has text, "Welcome to Xamarin Forms," here on the screen. That doesn't do anything yet until we get into each one of our individual projects. If we step into mainActivity.cs in our Android application, you'll notice that one of the things we do is load application, new app.
Let's get your font size a little bigger.
How big would you like to make it?
Say 24.
You want to bump it up to 24? I can just zoom in.
There we go.
Is that better? Okay, perfect. So loading application or load application new app. So we're going to load that new app class in the main activity. So again, if you're an Android developer, what are we dealing with for the UI? Well, you're dealing with activities. So main activity being that first one that will load up. In iOS applications, we focus on our app delegate, right? So again, in here, how are we getting to that point? Load application, new app. So that's basically what's going to bring up the UI for our application. And lo and behold, within the Windows Form application, we have a main page.xaml, but we also have main page.xaml.cs. And guess what we do? We load the application, new hello world Xamarin.app. So kind of a really quick rundown. That's basically what our project structure looks like for a Xamarin Forms application. Supporting 3 mobile platforms, Android, iOS, and Windows Phone. And
so the bulk of our code then is just in that one main project, and we've just got basically shims in all the others to go ahead and display the appropriate content.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Okay, perfect. I love it. All right. Well, now that we've got that all set up, I guess the next step then is to take a look at emulators, which will be the next module.
Yes.
And one more time, welcome back to Xamarin for Absolute Beginners. Alongside Jerry O'Brien, I'm Christopher Harrison. Now, we saw how to do the installation. We saw how to create that first little solution, get everything set up for all 3 environments. Now what we want to do is take a look at how we can do our testing in those environments by taking advantage of emulators. So first up, for those of you that aren't familiar with an emulator and the basic concept, when you go in to test your app, what you don't want to do is sideload it into the device every single time. It's just going to slow things down. So what you want to do is test it locally and use an emulator. Now, in order to use an emulator for Windows and Android, you can run those locally on either Windows or Mac OS X, with, again, the one catch there being, if you are going to do Mac OS X, you need to be doing Visual Studio and Parallels. Now, you'll notice the requirement. Not a virtual machine, has to be running locally. Now, if you're going to be checking out the emulator for iOS, that, of course, does have to be running on a Mac. However, you can connect to that remotely, so that way you can stay right there in the comfort of your Windows device and connect remotely to that Mac and run the emulator from there. Hey, Jerry, what does that look like?
Well, let's pop over to my PC, and we'll see an example of that.
I love it.
Perfect. So yeah, as Christopher mentioned, using the emulators locally is a great way for you to test your app in a relatively easy to use format. But also, one of the biggest advantages to testing with the emulators is that it allows you to test on multiple device types, sizes, screen resolutions, orientations, without having to purchase a whole bunch of devices. So if you're not like me, the gadget geek, and you don't want to have all these phones and PCs and laptops, use the emulators. So what we're going to do is take a look at this real fantastic application that we created that has that one form and the Welcome to Xamarin Forms text. And we're going to look at it on the emulator side. So the thing that's interesting about how we deal with our projects in Visual Studio, if you're a Visual Studio user, you're used to coming over and finding a project in your solution, right-clicking and going, hey, set this as the startup project. And you can do that in Xamarin Forms, but you can also select from the drop-down here which platform you wish to target. Okay? And that will handle changing your startup for you automatically. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the Hello Xamarin Droid application first. And you'll notice that I'm going to run it on an emulator. And in this case, what I have chosen is a 5-inch KitKat. So we're running on the 4.4 version of Android, and it's going to be the phone. But you'll see that we have some other emulators available here. Xamarin includes a couple of emulators, one that supports API 15 and one that supports API 20. But I really like the Visual Studio emulator. So that's the one that I'm going to choose, is the 5-inch KitKat. By the way, just as a reference or a way of letting you know that if you are, again, an Android developer, if you click this little button in the toolbar over here, this opens up your Android Virtual Device Manager, which allows you to take a look at existing AVDs that you have created, or you can create new ones based on existing definitions that are available. So if you're an Android developer and you're familiar with creating a whole bunch of different emulators, by all means, open up your AVD Manager and create some new emulators for your use. But let's go ahead and click on the Run button. We will start to deploy this to the emulator. And I just happen to have the Visual Studio Android emulator running because these take a little while to spin up. So we've kind of pre-spun the emulator so it's up and running. And this is what our amazing application looks like. Welcome to Xamarin Forms.
Okay.
Now, not only does it look really slick on that Android emulator, but what if I wanted to see what it looked like on a Windows Phone emulator? Well, I can choose Hello Xamarin Windows Phone 8. I can deploy to local machines. So this is an example of running it on a local machine if I wanted to target Windows 8. And again, if I had emulators, I could choose a simulator. But let's say we want to look at a Windows Phone, because we're talking mobile platforms today. We really want to focus on that. So we have a Windows Phone emulator. Again, remember how I mentioned earlier about the ability to test on a bunch of different devices. These are all the different Windows emulators that we have available. So we've got 10-inch tablets, we've got smaller phone sizes, 4-inch, 4.5, or 4.7-inch, all the way up to the 6-inch, different resolutions. But when we're testing, hey, here's a 512 meg emulator. Let's see how this thing will behave on something that might not have a whole lot of memory in it, right? So let's go ahead and deploy that to the Windows Phone emulator, which, by the way, we have running over here already. Let's see what that looks like.
I don't know that pre-spun is actually a word, by the way.
I invented it, so feel free to use it from this point on forward.
Royalty-free.
Royalty-free, and of course, because we were talking about pre-spinning now, we didn't want to behave. So we have it up and running, and lo and behold, look, here's our Welcome to Xamarin Forms.
Okay.
Notice it kind of looks the same as the other one.
And that's sort of the design.
Sort of the design. Now, we don't have the gradient background that look real cool, but, you know.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the goal here is just to get up and running.
The goal here is just to get up and running. Yeah. So what we're going to do now is take a look. So we've looked at the Android emulator. We've looked at the Windows Phone emulator. Now let's see what it looks like on when we go ahead and switch over and take a look at how we run this on the Mac emulator. So coming back to our PC, what we're going to do is I'm going to change over to the Hello Xamarin.ios, and you'll notice that I also have my iPhone plugged in. So, hey, it sees the iPhone plugged in, but let's not go that route just yet. Let's work with the iPhone simulator. And here's a key piece to remember. Before you decide to deploy to the iPhone emulator, make sure that your little Xamarin Mac agent screen showing a green icon. That means that we are connected to the Mac and we're ready to deploy. Once again, we have a bunch of different form factors that we can deploy to. Now, I'm just going to go with the 4S for today because I just want the smaller screen size to see how it looks on the Mac. I don't want to end up having to scroll the screen size over on the Mac itself. So we're in the process of building this. It'll do it starts to build, and Visual Studio starts running through it. You can watch your little progress down here with the little green bar as it works its way through. And then once that's ready, it will send the information over to the Mac agent, and the Mac agent will fire up the emulator on the Mac. So let's switch over to the Mac. All right, so we've switched over to our MacBook, and we can see that our emulator is now up and running. And we have that same familiar Welcome to Xamarin Forms screen that showed up from our wonderfully designed application. And
our high-end application.
Our high-end application, and we're going to make tons of money off of this. Somebody will.
Somebody will.
Somebody will.
Yeah.
So again, in short, hey, that's an example of the three emulators, right? So we've looked at the mobile emulator for Android, we've looked at the mobile emulator for the Windows Phone, and we've looked at the mobile emulator for the iOS, showing how we have to send all those wonderful commands across the wire, and brought it up and running on our MacBook Pro, and there we go.
I love that. And you were able to do all of that from Visual Studio.
I was able to do all that from Visual Studio.
So again, one more time, it's the tools, it's the platform, and everything else that you're already familiar with. Now, of course, once we get those emulators running, the next big question becomes, well, what about debugging? And that's what we'll take a look at in the next module. Welcome back once again to Xamarin for Absolute Beginners. That's Jerry O'Brien. I'm Christopher Harrison. Now, we took a look in the last section at how to take our app, put it onto an emulator. And obviously, what the emulator is going to allow you to do is go in and play around with things and test your app. And there's a good chance that at some point or another, you're going to have a bug in your code that you're going to need to track down. So the question then becomes, well, how do we do debugging? Well, here's actually the good news, is the fact that this module is actually going to be very short. Because, stop me if you've heard this before, it's Visual Studio. It's the exact same tooling that you're already familiar with. And what's amazingly cool about this, or I think it's amazingly cool, is the fact that even if you're using an emulator on Mac OS and you're developing right there on Windows, you can still do your debugging. In fact, Jerry, why don't you show us how that's done?
Yeah, I was going to say you're talking about errors in software code and debug. You've watched me code before, apparently.
Yes, yes.
That's why.
I've got a webcam in your office.
I'm the reason debugging is available. So
all because of Jerry.
All because of me. So I've been coding since forever, right?
Yeah.
Not really. So let's switch over to the PC. We're going to take a look at our application here again. I am connected to my Mac agent, so you can tell because I have my little green light up here on my Mac icon that says I'm connected. And what we're going to do is, Christopher mentioned, we could show you debugging on the Android emulator, debugging on the Windows Phone emulator, but it's not as impressive because it's on the same machine. What's really neat is debugging on the remote machine, so having the iOS simulator running on the Mac. So for this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop open my appdelegate.cs file. And I'm going to come down to right where we load the application. So right where we load that, and I'm going to drop in a breakpoint. And we're going to run it on our iPhone 5S simulator. And we'll start the deploy process. And then as this is going through the process of starting up the application over on the Mac, if we switch over to the Mac screen for just 1 second, we can see, hey, here's the splash screen for my application, and
it's not doing anything.
Yeah, it's not doing anything. It's just sitting there looking pretty. So let's switch back over to the PC again for a second, and you'll see that, yeah, indeed, we hit that breakpoint. So
there it is. And I also noticed down below that you've got the normal locals window.
We do, so we can explore this object.
I see what you did there. Clever. Clever.
We can explore the app object. So we have all of our locals. We have everything in here that we can work with. And of course, the Visual Studio IntelliSense is also present here as well. Mm-hmm. So we hover the mouse over it, we've got it available.
That's wonderful.
And we have our debug toolbar. So our step into, step over, step out. We can step through the code if we so choose, or we can say, nah, let's just continue. And then if we just pop back over to the Mac screen for a real quick second, we can see that indeed the application did continue running.
Okay.
So we're not going to write a whole bunch of code with errors in it, which is what I do on a daily basis. But this is, again, we just want to show that, yes, you can debug on the emulators but you're on your Visual Studio machine, emulator running on the Mac.
And so once again, all the same skills that you already have, you can now apply them here. So however it is that you would typically debug, you can do the exact same thing here.
Yep, precisely.
That's wonderful. All right. Well, then I guess the only last question to be raised is how do we actually take our app, put it onto a device, and stop me if you've heard this before. That'll be in the next module.
Yes.
One last time, welcome back again. That's Jerry O'Brien, and I'm Christopher Harrison. And this is, of course, Xamarin for Absolute Beginners. And so you may have figured out that our real goal here is just take a look, an overview of Xamarin. And before we go anywhere else on closing everything out, I do want to mention really quickly that there is an edX course that you can check out on Xamarin Forms. So that way, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, you can do that. And there's a Petzl book. Like 1,200 pages that will tell you everything that you might have ever wanted to know about Xamarin Forms, but we're afraid to ask. So if you're looking for more information, definitely check those out. In the meantime, though, we want to close out our little course by taking a look at how to take the app that you've created and put it onto an actual device, because emulators are great, but it's always best to check it out with other devices, especially if you're going to be doing things like sharing and so forth. So the way that we're going to get that onto a device is by taking advantage of a little thing known as sideloading. And sideloading is, in a nutshell, is basically going to allow me to put an app onto a phone, onto a device, without having to go through the store. Now, the catch is with sideloading that it has to be enabled. Now, getting that enabled is going to vary depending on whether you're using Windows Phone, Android, and iOS. And of course, all of that could change at any moment. But if you check out the developer sites on any one of those three, they'll walk you through the process of how to enable sideloading. Once you have it enabled, Jerry, how do you actually get it onto there?
We'll deploy it.
OK.
So
let's see it in action.
Let's see it in action. All right.
Yeah.
So the easiest way to do it, obviously, is to connect your device to your computer. Now, here's where we need to be careful about understanding how we're going to deploy to which specific device. If we're on our Windows PC, which is what this one here is, and we're going to deploy to either an Android device or a Windows Phone device, then we can simply plug it in with the USB cable to our computer, and then we can deploy directly from that. So I've got the Windows Phone up here right now. And we could easily do this on the Android device also, but we're going to show the Windows Phone because I can actually project the screen so you can see it on the computer. So let's flip back to our computer briefly here for a second. And what we're going to do is show you that I have set the Windows Phone project as the startup project. And you'll notice that from the drop down we have the Hello Xamarin WinPhone project ready to start. And rather than have the emulator selected here, we have device. So it will recognize and know that we have a device plugged in. And all I need to simply do is click on my little green play button for Start with Debugging. And you'll see that we're deploying the application. We get our little status bar down here. We now have an orange bar that basically says, hey, your application is ready. And if we switch over to the Project My Screen app, we do indeed see that we have the application deployed on the Windows Phone.
And that's actually on your phone.
And that's actually on my phone, right? So this is, I'm able to use my phone back and forth. If we scoot over here, we can see at the top, hey, there's my Hello Xamarin WinPhone application. And so we have indeed deployed it to that device.
Neat.
Now, with the Android application, it's pretty much the same concept. So we wouldn't need to worry too much about, anything different. So I'm not going to demonstrate that right now.
Okay.
But instead, what I do want to show is that there is a definite difference when you decide to deploy to an iPhone device. And as Christopher mentioned, you really need to go to the different developer sites for these devices to figure out how to either A, enable developer mode, or how to be able to deploy applications to your device. What I'm going to demonstrate for you is actually a failure, and it's going to be done on purpose. And the reason that I want to do this, to fail it purposely on iPhone, is just to let you know that it's a little more complicated. There's a little more complexity behind deploying to the iPhone device. First thing that you need to be aware of is in order to deploy to a physical iPhone device, you need to have it plugged into the Mac that the Xamarin Mac agent is running on. So you can't plug your iPhone into your PC. Even with iTunes installed on the PC, you can't plug it into the PC and expect to deploy it. Again, remember, Apple's licensing requires the build process of the code to happen on the PC. So I have my iPhone plugged into my Mac over here, and I have the application ready to run and ready to deploy from my PC. So let's switch to the PC briefly. And what I'm going to do is, from the drop-down, I will select Hello Xamarin.ios. And you'll notice that immediately it recognizes that my iPhone is plugged in. So, there's a lot of great intelligence built into these packages. And so let me go ahead and click on the Start with Debugging. And you'll notice that, well, it came back pretty quick. And so I kind of pre-staged this because it does take a while to do the build process. It does take a while for it to run through and physically fail. And you'll notice that down here in my output window, it said launch failed. The app could not be launched on Jerry's iPhone. Please check the logs for more details. So if you're a new developer to this, you're kind of going, oh, great. How do I check the logs? Where the heck do I find those? If you go to the Help menu on Visual Studio, find the little Xamarin entry and select Open Logs. It will open up the log folder and highlight the latest log. And if we double-click and open that log that was generated, and I'm not going to read all of it, and I apologize for that really fast scrolling, but basically if we come down to the bottom, we will run into a situation and which I'm not seeing. So what should have been pre-staged was a failure on the code signing. But again, there are everything in here. Couldn't parse iOS Simulator Apple TV. I may have chosen the wrong build or something. Again, it's really failed. So, but just as an example to show you, how it didn't work specifically, what I was intending to show you basically was, if we switch over to my Mac real briefly, in order to deploy an application onto an iPhone, you need to have an Apple developer account. You need to have the necessary certificates for development. So if we take a look, I'm actually on the developer.apple.com site here. You need to have an appropriate signing certificate for your application. You need to have the necessary app ID created, which I don't have a Hello Xamarin app created in here. That's part of the reason why it wouldn't deploy as well. And then you need to have the appropriate provisioning profile, and that needs to be downloaded and installed on the iPhone. So we didn't really want to spend a whole lot of time teaching you how to deploy apps on an iPhone, because that's a really involved process. What we wanted to show you was that you can deploy to the iPhone, but if you're not familiar with it, it's not as simple as deploying to the Windows Phone or to the Android phone. There's a lot involved in that. The Xamarin documentation helps walk you through that whole provisioning process, and to make sure that you've got that straight. The Apple developer site, of course, has all that information on there as well. So if you're an Apple developer, you probably already have your certificates, and you know how to create those provisioning profiles. So, again, without stepping through all of that, that is an example of deploying to a physical device.
Okay. All right. So it looks like if something does go wrong, we can get a lot of information on how to start debugging that. Fantastic. All right. So hopefully by the end of all of this, you've seen how to get started with Xamarin and Xamarin Forms. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want to continue to dig deeper, which hopefully you do, check out the edX course that's available, and definitely check out the book as well. With that, want to thank everybody for tuning in. That is